Richard Coleman was a man used to silence at the end of long nights. For 30 years he had built his empire brick by brick, sacrificing friendships, sleep, even his marriage, until his name meant power in boardrooms across the country. He had everything: money, influence, the loyalty of men who had stood beside him since the beginning. At least, that's what he believed. On a quiet winter evening, he stepped into his black Mercedes expecting nothing more than the hum of the engine and the familiar drive home. But before he could even place the key in the ignition, a fragile voice broke the night. "Shut up. Don't say a word. They're watching you." He froze, heart pounding, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light inside the car. In the back seat, a little girl no older than 7 stared back at him, her eyes wide with fear. What was she doing there? And why would those 5 words unravel a fortune worth $400 million? The reason would change everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Richard's breath caught in his chest, his hands hovering above the steering wheel, as if even the smallest movement might betray them both. The girl's name, he would soon learn, was Naomi, a child with nowhere to go and yet somehow standing between him and a disaster that could destroy everything he had built. But what could a 7-year-old possibly know that would send a chill through the veins of a man worth hundreds of millions? Why had she chosen him of all people to warn? And who exactly were the faceless watchers she feared in the shadows of that parking lot? Richard had built Coleman Technologies on trust. Trust in his partner, trust in his assistant, trust in the loyalty he believed money could buy. But Naomi's whisper raised a darker possibility: that betrayal was already festering inside his empire, and that the real question was not whether he could save it, but whether he could survive it. Richard Coleman had not been born into wealth. His story was one of relentless ambition, the kind America loves to tell itself it still rewards. From a cramped apartment in Ohio to the towering glass headquarters of Coleman Technologies, he had spent 3 decades turning a small software startup into a corporation valued at $250 million. His success was not accidental. It was built on tireless work and the steady support of those he thought he could trust. At his side for 20 years was Daniel Cross, his closest friend and partner, a man he once described as the brother he never had. And for the last decade, Evelyn Harper, his executive assistant, had been the steady hand guiding his schedule, guarding his time, and whispering advice in his ear. To Richard, they were family. To Richard, loyalty was the bedrock of business. But blind trust was his greatest flaw, and it was the weakness that Naomi's whisper would soon expose. Naomi's life had followed a far different path. At 7 years old, she had already seen more than most children could imagine. A foster system stretched thin had left her drifting between shelters and crowded homes, learning to survive with sharp eyes and a quicker mind. She noticed things others dismissed. She listened when adults thought she was invisible. And on one cold evening, when Richard believed he was simply walking to his car, Naomi had overheard words that would place her at the center of a conspiracy worth $400 million. Daniel Cross and Evelyn Harper, the very people Richard trusted above all others, were already plotting a deal with foreign investors, a deal that would leave him stripped of everything. What Richard thought was the foundation of his empire was already cracked, and it would take the warning of a child to show him how close it was to collapse. Naomi had not been looking for Richard Coleman that night. She had been looking for warmth, for somewhere safe to rest, when she slipped into the shadows of Coleman Technologies and found herself in the wrong place at the most dangerous time. On the 10th floor, through a half-open door, she heard laughter. Daniel Cross, the man Richard trusted like a brother, and Evelyn Harper, the woman who managed every detail of his empire, were speaking with the kind of casual cruelty only possible when the victim is far away. They mocked Richard openly. Daniel's voice dripped with disdain as he told Evelyn, By tomorrow, he'll sign away his empire without a clue. Evelyn's laugh followed, sharp and unkind, echoing down the hall. Naomi understood enough to know they weren't joking. The words carried weight, and the smugness in their tone made it clear this was no mistake. It was betrayal. Her heart raced, but instead of running, Naomi acted. She crept quietly to the parking garage and slipped into the back seat of Richard's black Mercedes, curling herself into the shadows. She knew she had no right to be there, but something inside her insisted he had to be warned. When Richard entered and she whispered for him not to speak, his world shifted in an instant. For years, he had believed loyalty protected him, that trust was unbreakable. Yet in the eyes of a 7-year-old child, he saw a truth he had ignored too long. His closest allies had already prepared his downfall. Naomi had overheard their scheme, but her presence in that car carried more than a warning. Unknown to Richard, their lives were bound together in ways neither of them yet understood. Richard Coleman did not sleep that night. The whisper of a child and the echo of mocking laughter circled in his mind like a storm he could not quiet. Trust was the foundation of his empire, but now it felt like a trap. At dawn, he made a call he had never imagined he would need to make. Michael Trent was an ex-cop turned private investigator, once employed by Coleman Technologies until Daniel Cross and Evelyn Harper forced him out, claiming budget cuts. In truth, they feared his persistence and sharp eye for corruption. Richard's voice on the line was quiet but urgent. He needed proof. Within days, Michael uncovered what Richard could barely bring himself to believe. Embezzlement, shell companies registered in false names, transactions carefully hidden across borders, more than $6 million stolen from beneath his nose. Naomi refused to remain a bystander. Her small stature and sharp instincts allowed her to hear and see things adults overlooked. She began feeding Richard and Michael small details, snippets of conversations, names she overheard, meetings whispered in corners. But doubt followed her. Could a child truly grasp what she claimed to know? Some dismissed her as confused or seeking attention. Conflicting accounts spread through the building. Rumors twisted until the board began to whisper among themselves. Was Richard Coleman losing control, or worse, losing his grip on reality? He knew one thing for certain: the betrayal was real, and Naomi had given him the only warning that stood between him and ruin. Richard Coleman had spent his life studying contracts, numbers, and the fine print that built his empire, but now he turned those same instincts toward survival. As Michael Trent dug deeper, patterns emerged. Daniel Cross had been moving money quietly into offshore accounts, convinced no one would ever trace the path. Evelyn Harper, with her careful hand and sweet assurances, had been forging documents to cover the trail. For years, they had prepared the perfect deception. What they had not counted on was Naomi. With her quick ears and fearless curiosity, she slipped into places unseen, and one evening, she captured a recording so damning it froze Richard where he stood, Daniel's voice unmistakable, mocking him as a fool. Evelyn laughing, confirming the plan to strip him of everything. It was the evidence Richard needed, and yet he showed nothing. He greeted Daniel and Evelyn with the same calm smile, nodded in meetings, and signed minor papers as if he remained the trusting man they had always known. Behind that mask, he was preparing his countermove. The Japanese investors' meeting was approaching, the moment Daniel and Evelyn believed would cement their control. But Richard was setting a different stage. He let them think they had already won, while in truth, every step he took was a piece of a trap closing slowly around them. In boardrooms and corridors, tension rose like a storm on the horizon. Two sides prepared for war, one blinded by arrogance, the other fueled by betrayal and the whisper of a child who refused to be silent. The conference room at Coleman Technologies had never felt more tense. Outside, the skyline glittered with promise, but inside, every detail was carefully staged. International investors sat in polished chairs, briefcases at their feet, their eyes on the man they believed was about to surrender his company. Daniel Cross leaned back with the smile of a man who thought he had already won. Evelyn Harper placed the contracts on the table, tabs marked, her voice calm as she urged Richard to sign as he always had. For a moment, Richard Coleman appeared the same trusting leader he had always been. Then he looked up, his eyes sharper than they had been in years, and the mask slipped. With one motion, he connected his laptop to the projector, and the screen lit up. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, forged documents. The faces of Daniel and Evelyn shifted from confidence to disbelief. Michael Trent stepped forward, a thick folder in his hands, distributing copies to stunned investors and the federal investigators quietly waiting at the door. Naomi's recording filled the room, the unmistakable voices of Daniel and Evelyn laughing about the downfall of the man who had trusted them most. Gasps echoed as the trap closed, chairs scraped, cameras clicked, and in real time, law enforcement officers moved in. Daniel Cross and Evelyn Harper were placed in handcuffs as investors whispered in shock. Richard stood silent, not in triumph, but in grim acknowledgement. His company had been saved, but one question lingered heavier than all the rest. Who exactly was Naomi, and why had a child risked everything to protect a man she barely knew? In the weeks that followed, the story of Daniel Cross and Evelyn Harper's betrayal spread across financial headlines. But inside Richard Coleman's world, a quieter revelation reshaped everything. As Michael Trent combed through records tracing names and connections that Daniel and Evelyn had tried to bury, one discovery stopped Richard cold. Naomi's grandmother had once carried the name Lillian Coleman. Lillian was Richard's estranged cousin, a woman his family had lost contact with decades earlier. Naomi was not simply the stranger who had saved him. She was blood, a hidden piece of his family he had never known existed. For a man who had thought betrayal had left him with nothing, it was as if the universe had returned what mattered most. The board celebrated their rescue, the investors stayed, and Coleman Technologies stood stronger than ever. But Richard's greatest decision came quietly. He began the process of adoption, ensuring that Naomi would never again be a child slipping through the cracks. In the courtroom, when the papers were signed, Richard placed his hand over hers, no longer the wary CEO but the guardian of a family rediscovered. His empire had been preserved, but more than that, he had gained something no fortune could buy: the chance to rebuild not just a company, but a legacy bound by blood and trust. In the months that followed, Richard Coleman often found himself standing at the tall windows of his office, watching the city move beneath him. He thought of the years he had spent believing that loyalty was unshakable, that those closest to him could never betray him. Daniel Cross and Evelyn Harper had mistaken that trust for weakness, but Richard now understood something deeper. They mistook trust for weakness, he would say quietly, but justice, courage, and family are stronger than greed. Naomi's life began to transform. No longer drifting through shelters, she thrived in school, her sharp mind nurtured instead of overlooked. With Richard's support, she helped launch a scholarship foundation for children like her, giving others the second chance she had seized for herself. And Richard, once a man consumed by work, became a stronger, wiser leader. He carried scars of betrayal, but beside him stood Naomi, living proof that even in the wreckage of broken trust, something far greater could be built. As Richard Coleman looked back on the night that changed everything, one question refused to leave his mind. What would you have done if a child whispered those words to you? Would you have listened, or dismissed her as a frightened voice in the dark? For Richard, those 5 words saved not only his fortune, but his life, uncovering betrayal that reached into the heart of his empire and leading him to Naomi, the hidden family he never knew he had. Betrayal had forced him to confront the cost of blind trust, but it had also given him something far greater in return: renewed strength, a wiser heart, and a daughter who embodied the resilience he now carried forward. And if you thought betrayal couldn't get darker, wait until you hear the next story we uncover. Subscribe for more true stories where reality is stranger than fiction, and join us as we continue to explore how a single moment can change everything.